They thought humiliating her would be entertainment, but they had no idea they were about to insult the woman who owned everything around them. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd really appreciate your support. Take a quick moment to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. It's completely free and helps us keep bringing you more powerful and emotional content. Also, I'd love to know where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thanks so much for being here. The golden lights of the Langford Heights rooftop shimmered across polished marble as the city skyline stretched for miles. A sea of glass towers and quiet power. The kind of place where deals worth millions were made over soft laughter and crystal glasses, and where every person inside believed they belonged at the top of the world. Every person except the woman who had just stepped through the doors unnoticed. Evelyn Carter moved quietly, her simple navy dress falling just below her knees. Her flat shoes making soft, steady taps against the marble floor. No designer labels, no glitter, nothing that matched the sharp silhouettes and tailored suits surrounding her. And yet her eyes were calm, observant, taking in every corner of the room as if she'd seen it all before. Conversation slowed as heads turned subtly, not with curiosity, but with quiet judgment, the kind that didn't need words. A raised eyebrow here, a faint smirk there, whispers carried under the hum of a string quartet. Who let her in? Someone murmured near the bar. Probably staff, another replied, barely hiding a laugh. Across the room, Victoria Langford stood at the center of attention, her silver gown catching every flicker of light, as if the night itself revolved around her. She was used to control, used to deciding who belonged and who didn't, and the moment her eyes landed on Evelyn, she tilted her head slightly, studying her like an out-of-place detail in an otherwise perfect painting, the smile on. Her lips wasn't warm. It was sharp, calculated. She took a slow step forward, heels clicking with purpose, drawing attention as conversations faded into a curious hush. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice smooth but edged with something colder. "I think you might be in the wrong place, eh?" Few nearby guests chuckled softly, their eyes now fixed on Evelyn as if waiting for her to stumble, to apologize, to shrink. But Evelyn didn't move. She didn't rush to explain. She simply met Victoria's gaze with a steady calm that felt almost unsettling. And for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something Victoria couldn't quite place and didn't like. She laughed lightly, brushing it off as she gestured toward the exit. "This is a private event," she added, louder now, making sure others could hear. "We have standards here." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, and the room leaned in, waiting, because what none of them realized in that moment was that they were about to cross a line they could never uncross. The laughter did not erupt loudly at first. It spread in small waves, subtle, controlled, the kind of laughter meant to exclude rather than entertain, and Evelyn Carter stood at the center of it without reacting, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, as if she had all the time in the world. Victoria Langford's smile sharpened as she noticed the lack of response. She was used to reactions, to flustered apologies, to people shrinking under her gaze. But this quiet stillness felt different, almost defiant, and it irritated her more than open resistance ever could. "I do not think you understand," Victoria continued, taking another step closer, her voice now carrying across the polished space, drawing more eyes, more attention. "This event is invitation only, very exclusive, and we are quite careful about who we allow in." A man near the bar adjusted his cufflinks and smirked. A woman beside him whispered something behind her glass, their eyes flicking between Victoria and Evelyn like spectators waiting for the next move in a carefully staged performance. Evelyn's gaze drifted briefly past Victoria, scanning the room again, the skyline glowing behind the glass walls, the reflection of chandeliers shimmering across the floor, the arrangement of staff along the perimeter, every detail settling quietly into place in her mind. Then she looked back at Victoria, calm, composed. "I understand exactly where I am," she said softly, her voice steady enough to cut through the murmurs without ever rising. And for a fraction of a second, the room hesitated. The reaction was not what they expected. Victoria let out a light laugh, louder this time, inviting others to join. "Oh, I am sure you do," she replied, her tone dripping with polished condescension. But understanding where you are and belonging here are two very different things. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Someone chuckled openly now. Emboldened, a phone lifted slightly higher to capture the moment, and still Evelyn did not move, did not defend herself, did not argue, which only seemed to encourage Victoria further. "Tell me," Victoria added, tilting her head as if genuinely curious, "who exactly invited you?" The question hung in the air like a spotlight. Several guests leaned in, waiting, eager to hear the answer, eager to confirm their assumptions. Evelyn paused for just a moment, not out of uncertainty, but as if choosing her words carefully. Then she simply said, "I did." The simplicity of the answer landed oddly, not dramatic, not defensive, just quiet certainty, and it triggered another round of laughter, louder now, less restrained. A man near the center shook his head. "That is not how this works," he muttered, and Victoria's smile widened, sensing complete control of the situation. "No," she agreed smoothly. "It really is not." She gestured subtly toward one of the staff members near the entrance, a young security attendant who hesitated for a split second before beginning to move forward, uncertain but obedient. The shift was small but noticeable, the atmosphere tightening just enough to signal that this was no longer just a joke. It was becoming a removal, a correction, and yet Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, almost thoughtful, as if she were watching something unfold that she had already seen before. The music continued in the background, but softer now. Conversations had faded into near silence, all attention narrowing toward this single moment, and in that silence, something subtle shifted, not in the crowd, not in Victoria, but somewhere deeper in the room, something unseen, unnoticed by most, as if an invisible thread had just been pulled, and the next move had already been set in motion. The security attendant slowed as he approached, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble, but his hesitation was visible, his eyes flicking not to Victoria, but briefly toward the far end of the room where the senior staff usually stood, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet arrived. Victoria noticed the hesitation, and her expression tightened for a fraction of a second before she masked it with a confident smile. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone still smooth but carrying an edge now. The attendant straightened slightly, caught between authority and uncertainty. "No, ma'am," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Evelyn watched the exchange quietly, her gaze steady, almost curious, as if observing a small crack forming in an otherwise flawless surface. Around them the guests leaned in closer, whispers growing sharper, more expectant. "Why is this taking so long?" someone muttered, another voice added. "This should have been handled already." The pressure in the room began to shift, subtle but undeniable. Victoria took a step forward again, reclaiming control, her heels striking the floor with deliberate precision. "Let me make this simple," she said, her voice now carrying across the entire rooftop, silencing even the soft music in the background. "You are not on the guest list, you were not invited, and you are disrupting an event that does not include you." Her words landed clean, rehearsed, designed to leave no room for argument. A few guests nodded in approval, their confidence returning as the narrative aligned once more with their expectations. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not in submission but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she had just confirmed something she already knew. Then she reached into her small handbag, the movement calm, unhurried, drawing immediate attention. Several people leaned forward, expecting perhaps an invitation, a pass, some proof that would justify her presence. Victoria folded her arms, watching with a faint, amused smile, certain that whatever came next would only reinforce her position. Evelyn pulled out her phone, a simple device, nothing flashy, and for a brief moment she looked down at the screen, her thumb moving once, a single action, quick and precise. Then she slipped the phone back into her bag without another word. The simplicity of it seemed almost anticlimactic. A few guests exchanged confused glances. One of them laughed softly. "That is it?" he whispered, and Victoria let out a quiet breath of amusement, shaking her head slightly. "If you are finished," she said, gesturing again toward the exit. But before the security attendant could take another step, something shifted, this time not subtle, not hidden, a man in a dark suit. Near the far entrance suddenly straightened, his hand rising to his earpiece, his expression changing from passive to alert in an instant. Another staff member mirrored the movement, then another, like a silent chain reaction moving through the perimeter of the room. Conversations faltered, the energy shifted, the laughter died mid-breath. Victoria's smile flickered, just for a second, as she noticed the change, her eyes darting toward the staff, confusion breaking through her composed exterior. "What is going on?" she demanded quietly, but no one answered her immediately, because in that moment, the room was no longer focused on her. It was turning, slowly but unmistakably, toward Evelyn, who stood exactly where she had been the entire time, calm, still, her eyes steady as the invisible balance of power in the room began to tilt. And for the first time that night, uncertainty did not belong to her. It belonged to everyone else. The shift was no longer subtle. It moved through the room like a quiet current, invisible but undeniable. One by one the staff along the edges straightened, their attention snapping away from the guests and locking onto something far more important. A man near the service bar stepped back abruptly, as if he had just received instructions he could not ignore. Another staff member hurried across the floor, no longer blending into the background, but moving with purpose, the kind of urgency that did not belong in a room built on controlled elegance. Conversations collapsed into fragments, glasses paused halfway to lips, and for the first time that night, the balance of attention was no longer in Victoria Langford's hands. She felt it instantly. The shift, the loss of control, her posture stiffened, her smile fading just enough to reveal the tension underneath. "I asked a question," she said, her voice lower now, but sharper, directed not at Evelyn, but at the nearest staff member, who avoided her gaze entirely. "What is happening?" But no answer came. Not immediately, because the answer was already walking toward them. From the far end of the rooftop, through the parted crowd, a man in a tailored black suit moved with measured speed, his expression composed but unmistakably serious, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention but commanded it. Several guests recognized him and stepped aside instinctively. Whispers rippled again, but this time they carried confusion instead of amusement. "Is that the operations director?" someone murmured. "Why is he here?" Another voice followed. The man did not acknowledge anyone as he approached, his focus fixed, unwavering, until he reached Evelyn, and then something happened that no one in that room expected. He stopped, straightened, and lowered his head slightly in a gesture of respect so subtle, yet so powerful that it sent a visible ripple through the crowd. The room went completely silent, not the soft silence of polite society, but the heavy, stunned quiet of realization beginning to form. Victoria's breath caught for just a moment, her eyes narrowing as she tried to process what she was seeing. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly, stepping forward again, her voice rising just enough to reclaim attention, but it no longer carried the same authority, not after what everyone had just witnessed. The man turned his head slightly toward her, his expression polite but firm. "No mistake, ma'am," he said, his tone measured, professional. "We were notified immediately." Victoria blinked, her confidence faltering. "Notified of what?" she demanded, and for the first time, her voice did not sound certain. The man paused, then looked back at Evelyn, waiting, not speaking out of turn, as if the next move did not belong to him. It belonged to her, and Evelyn, who had stood quietly through every whisper, every laugh, every insult, finally shifted her weight slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room once more. Slower this time, deliberate, meeting eyes that now looked very different from before, no longer amused, no longer superior, but searching, uncertain. And then she spoke, her voice calm, steady, impossible to ignore. "I think the evening has been quite informative," she said, not raising her tone. Yet every word carried across the marble floor as if the room itself had leaned in to listen. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately, because deep down, something had already begun to settle into place. A realization she did not want to accept, but could no longer avoid. And in that moment, as the silence stretched and the weight of it pressed down on every person in that room, the truth stood quietly at the center of it all, waiting to be fully revealed. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the rooftop like a weight no one could ignore, and in that stillness, Evelyn Carter finally took a single step forward. Not rushed, not hesitant, just measured, deliberate, the kind of movement that shifted the room without force. The man beside her straightened instinctively, stepping slightly behind her now, no longer leading, only following, and that alone told the story most of them were not yet ready to hear. Victoria Langford stood frozen for a fraction longer before forcing herself to recover, her posture lifting, her chin rising. Clinging to the last threads of authority she believed she still held. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," she began, her voice carefully controlled but no longer smooth, "it can be resolved privately." The offer was not kindness, it was retreat disguised as composure, but Evelyn did not accept it. She did not step aside, did not lower her voice. She simply looked at Victoria with the same calm expression she had held from the beginning, and in that gaze there was no anger, no need to prove anything, only quiet certainty. "No," Evelyn said softly, and the single word landed heavier than anything spoken before. "I think everyone should understand exactly what is happening." A faint ripple moved through the guests, discomfort replacing curiosity, because now they could feel it. Something irreversible was unfolding. The man in the black suit spoke again, his tone formal, precise. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully, "would you like us to proceed?" The name echoed through the room. Carter, it lingered just long enough for recognition to begin flickering in a few minds. A man near the back stiffened, his eyes widening slightly as he whispered to the woman beside him. "Carter, as in Carter Holdings?" Her expression shifted instantly, confusion turning into alarm, and that whisper did not stay contained. It moved, quietly but quickly, from one guest to another, like a spark catching dry air. Evelyn did not rush to confirm it. She did not announce it with pride. She simply allowed the realization to arrive on its own, watching as faces changed, as posture shifted, as the same people who had laughed moments ago now stood still, calculating, uncertain. Victoria's expression faltered, the confidence draining from it piece by piece as the names settled into place. She knew it. Of course she did. Everyone in that room knew it. The company that owned half the skyline, the developments, the investments, the very building they were standing in. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came, because suddenly every word she had said earlier echoed back at her with a different weight. Every laugh, every gesture, every assumption, and none of it could be taken back. Evelyn turned her gaze briefly toward the city beyond the glass, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance, then back to the room. "I built this company quietly," she said, her voice even, steady, "because I believe that what matters is what you create, not what you wear." The words were not harsh, but they carried a clarity that cut deeper than any accusation. No one moved, no one interrupted, because there was nothing left to challenge, only truth standing in the center of the room, undeniable. And in that moment Victoria Langford, surrounded by everything she thought defined power, realized she had never understood it at all, and the room, once filled with laughter, now stood completely still, as respect, real respect, finally took its place. No one dared to speak, not because they were told to remain silent, but because something far more powerful had taken over the room, the kind of silence that follows truth when it finally reveals itself without permission. Evelyn Carter did not raise her voice, did not demand attention, and yet every person stood still as if waiting for her next word to decide what happened next. Victoria Langford felt it most of all, the shift that had stripped away every layer of certainty she had relied on. Just moments ago, her hands, once steady and composed, now rested stiffly at her sides, her mind racing to recover control, to reframe the situation, to say something that could undo what had already been done. "Ms. Carter," she began carefully, forcing a polite tone that sounded unfamiliar even to herself. "If there has been any misunderstanding this evening, I assure you it was not intentional." The words were carefully chosen, practiced, an attempt to rebuild authority through formality. But the room did not respond the way it had before. No approving nods, no supportive murmurs, only stillness. Watching, waiting, Evelyn turned her gaze toward Victoria, not sharply, not coldly, but with a quiet clarity that made it impossible to hide behind rehearsed phrases. "It was not a misunderstanding," she said, her voice calm, each word deliberate. Was a judgment. The sentence landed with precision, and for a moment Victoria could not respond, because there was no space left to deflect, no angle left to reposition herself. Around them the guests shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others pretending to examine their glasses or adjust their jackets, anything to avoid being seen in the reflection of what had just happened. The man in the black suit stepped slightly forward again, not to interrupt, but to support. "Ms. Carter," he said respectfully, "we can make immediate changes regarding event management and guest coordination moving forward." His words were professional, but the meaning was clear. Consequences were already being considered, and everyone in that room understood what that meant. Evelyn glanced briefly at him, then back at the crowd, her expression unchanged. "That will not be necessary," she replied. And that answer created a different kind of tension, unexpected because they had anticipated. Reaction, punishment, correction, but not restraint. She took a slow step forward, just enough to stand fully at the center of the room, where moments ago she had been treated as an outsider, and now stood as the one person no one could ignore. "Tonight was not about the event," she continued, her voice steady. "It was about how quickly people decide who deserves respect and who does not." Her eyes moved across the room, meeting faces that now looked very different, stripped of certainty, filled instead with reflection. And in that moment the weight of what she was saying settled deeper than any consequence could. Victoria swallowed, her composure cracking just slightly as she realized that this was not a situation she could fix with influence or apology alone. Because the damage was not external, it was exposed, visible, undeniable. She started, but stopped, the words failing to form. Because for the first time she was not speaking from power, she was searching for understanding. Evelyn watched her quietly, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, as if recognizing the moment for what it was, a turning point, not just for one person, but for everyone who had stood in that room and chosen silence when it mattered. And as the city lights continued to glow beyond the glass, reflecting a world built on ambition and perception, something far quieter settled inside that space, something that could not be bought, performed, or inherited, only earned. And in that stillness, the lesson became impossible to ignore, because respect, once lost in a moment of arrogance, does not return the same way it was given. The air did not return to normal. It remained suspended, as if the entire rooftop had been paused in a moment that refused to move forward without acknowledgement. And Evelyn Carter allowed that silence to linger, not to dominate the room, but to let it settle, to make sure it was understood, because moments like this were not meant to be rushed, they were meant to be felt. Victoria Langford stood across from her, no longer the center of attention, no longer the one controlling the narrative. Her shoulders slightly lowered, her confidence replaced by something far less familiar, awareness. She glanced around briefly, as if searching for support, for someone to restore the balance she had always relied on. But no one stepped in, no one spoke, because everyone understood now that the balance had never belonged to her in the first place. Evelyn shifted her gaze away from Victoria and toward the rest of the guests, her eyes moving slowly, deliberately, meeting each expression, and what she saw was no longer arrogance, but reflection, discomfort, and in some cases, quiet regret. A man who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact entirely. A woman who had whispered behind her glass now held it still, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem. The room had changed, not because of power, but because of clarity, and Evelyn recognized that. She understood that this moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about revealing something that had always been there. Unnoticed, she took a slow breath, then spoke again, her voice calm, steady, but softer now, less like a statement and more like a truth being placed carefully in front of them. "I did not come here to make a point," she said. "I came here to observe." The words carried gently, but their meaning reached deeper than before, because now the room was listening differently, not with judgment, but with attention. "And what I saw tonight," she continued, "was not about status or wealth or influence." She paused briefly, allowing the weight of the next words to settle before they were spoken. It was about how quickly respect disappears when it is based on appearance alone. A faint shift moved through the crowd, not visible, but felt, like a quiet realization passing from one person to another. Victoria lowered her gaze slightly, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, because for the first time, she was not reacting, she was understanding. Evelyn let the silence return once more, but this time it was different. It was no longer heavy, it was reflective. And in that reflection, something changed, something subtle but lasting. The man in the black suit stepped forward again, his voice measured, respectful. "Ms. Carter, the board has already been informed," he said. "They are requesting your direction moving forward." His words carried a different kind of weight, not urgency, but responsibility, and every person in that room knew what that meant. Decisions would be made, consequences would follow, not out of anger, but out of principle. Evelyn turned slightly toward him, considering for a moment. Then she gave a small nod, not rushed, not dramatic, just certain. "We will address it tomorrow," she said, her tone calm, final, and with that, she turned back toward the room one last time, her presence steady, her expression composed. "For now," she added softly, "I believe the lesson has already been delivered." No one argued, no one questioned it, because they all knew it was true. The lesson was not spoken loudly, it was not forced, but it had settled into the room in a way that could not be ignored. And as Evelyn Carter took a step back, no longer at the center, but no longer unseen, the room remained still, not because it had to, but because it understood, and in that quiet understanding, something far more valuable than status had been restored, something that could not be measured, only recognized when it was finally revealed. No one moved to stop her as Evelyn Carter stepped away from the center of the room. But something had already shifted too deeply for the night to simply continue as if nothing had happened. The music, once soft and elegant, now felt distant, almost out of place, like it belonged to a different moment entirely. Conversations did not resume, not right away, because the weight of what had just unfolded lingered in every corner of the rooftop, and the people who had once filled the space with confidence now stood in quiet reflection, unsure of how to return to who they had been just minutes before. Victoria Langford remained where she stood, her posture no longer rigid with control, but held together by awareness, her eyes following Evelyn as she moved calmly toward the edge of the glass wall, where the city lights stretched endlessly below. For a moment Victoria hesitated, the instinct to walk away pulling against something else, something unfamiliar but stronger. Accountability, and slowly, carefully, she took a step forward, then another, until she stood a few feet behind Evelyn, not as a host, not as someone in charge, but simply as a person trying to understand. The distance between them was small, but the shift it represented was immense. "Ms. Carter," Victoria said quietly, her voice no longer carrying across the room, no longer shaped for an audience, but real, measured, and for the first time that night, uncertain. Evelyn did not turn immediately. She kept her gaze on the skyline, the reflection of the city, dancing faintly in the glass before her. Then after a brief pause, she spoke. "You do not need to explain." Her tone was not dismissive, but calm, as if she had already heard everything Victoria was trying to say without words. Victoria exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "I think I do," she replied, her voice steady but softer than before. "Because what happened tonight should not have happened." The admission did not echo loudly, but it carried through the silence, and those close enough to hear it understood its weight. Evelyn turned then, meeting Victoria's gaze once more, and this time there was no challenge between them, no silent battle for control, only a moment of clarity shared between two people standing on opposite sides of a lesson that had just unfolded. "It happened because it was easy," Evelyn said simply. "It is always easy to decide who belongs based on what you see." Victoria nodded slowly, the truth settling in without resistance. Around them the room remained quiet, but no longer tense. The atmosphere had changed into something more reflective, more aware. A few guests began to move again, but carefully, as if conscious of every step, every word, as if the space itself demanded a different kind of presence now. The man in the black suit remained nearby, observing, ready, but no longer needing to intervene because the situation had already resolved itself in a way no one had anticipated. Evelyn glanced once more across the room, taking in the faces that now looked back at her with something entirely different from before. Not admiration, not fear, but respect, genuine and unforced. And then she gave a small nod, almost to herself, as if confirming that what needed to be understood had been understood. Victoria lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up, her expression no longer guarded. "Thank you," she said quietly, not as a formality, but as an acknowledgement of something deeper, something she had not expected to learn that night. Evelyn did not respond with words. She simply held her gaze for a moment, then turned back toward the city, and in that quiet exchange, without announcement, without spectacle, the night reached its turning point, not defined by power, but by the quiet recognition of what it truly meant. The night did not return to what it had been. It could not, because something deeper than atmosphere had changed, something that lingered long after words had been spoken and silences had settled. Evelyn Carter remained by the glass for a moment longer, the city stretching endlessly before her, each light a reminder of the world she had built not through appearances, but through quiet decisions no one had ever seen. Behind her, the rooftop slowly began to breathe again, not with the same careless confidence as before, but with a measured awareness. Conversations resumed in softer tones, laughter returned but restrained, as if everyone present now understood that every word carried weight, every glance held meaning. Victoria Langford stood where she had been, no longer the center of the room, but no longer unaware. She watched as the guests shifted around her, their behavior changed, their posture different. And for the first time, she saw the room not as something she controlled, but as something she had misunderstood. The power she had once believed came from status now felt fragile, incomplete, and in its place, something far more grounded began to take shape. Understanding. Evelyn finally turned away from the skyline, her movements calm, unhurried, and began walking toward the exit, not escorted, not announced, simply leaving the way she had entered, without needing attention. Yet every eye followed her, not out of curiosity, but out of respect, genuine and unspoken. The man in the black suit stepped aside as she passed, his posture straight, his expression composed, but his eyes reflecting the same acknowledgement that had spread through the room. No words were needed, because everything that mattered had already been understood. As Evelyn reached the doors, she paused briefly, not to look back at any one person, but at the space itself, the room that had revealed more than it had intended. And then she stepped out, disappearing into the quiet night beyond. Inside, the rooftop remained still for just a moment longer, as if holding on to the lesson before allowing the night to continue. Victoria took a slow breath, her gaze lowering, then lifting again with a different kind of clarity, not defensive, not performative, but thoughtful. And as she moved through the room once more, it was no longer with the certainty of someone who believed she knew everything, but with the awareness of someone who had just learned something that could not be unlearned. The guests, too, carried that shift with them, in the way they spoke, in the way they looked at one another, in the quiet recognition that respect was not something granted by appearance, but something revealed through character. And as the city lights continued to glow beyond the glass, unchanged and constant, the people inside that rooftop carried something new with them, something far more valuable than status, something that would follow them long after the night had ended. And that day, without spectacle, without announcement, the world reminded them what dignity truly looks like. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.